The price of a horse could reach $100. A healthy mule could cost even more. But somewhere in the dying days of American slavery, in the winter of 1864, one frightened child was sold for only $3. 3 silver coins. That was all it took to erase a name, separate a family, and place a young boy into a future no one could imagine. History remembers famous generals, celebrated presidents, and victorious armies. It records the dates of battles and the signatures that ended wars. Yet hidden beneath those pages are lives so small, so forgotten, that they seem destined to disappear forever. This is one of those lives, a child called Thomas Freeman, a boy who possessed nothing except a stubborn will to survive, a child who never carried a weapon, yet whose choices would quietly shape events far beyond anything he could understand. And it all began with a sale so insignificant that no newspaper reported it. No official record honored it. No witness imagined its consequences. Only silence remained. Until now, the winter wind swept across central Virginia with an unforgiving chill. The war had already scarred the countryside beyond recognition. Fields that once shimmered with tobacco now stood abandoned beneath gray skies. Wooden fences leaned crooked after years of neglect. Smoke drifted from distant plantations where food had become scarce and fear had become common. Every road carried soldiers, every church carried prayers, every family carried grief. The great conflict tearing America apart had entered its bloodiest years. Confederate forces struggled to defend shrinking territory. Union armies pressed relentlessly southward. The sound of distant cannon fire had become as familiar as church bells. Yet, for the enslaved families scattered across Virginia, the war offered something far more confusing than hope. Rumors. Nothing but rumors. Some whispered that freedom had already arrived. Others insisted it was another cruel lie. Old men argued beneath oak trees. Women exchanged secret conversations while drawing water from wells. Children listened quietly, trying to understand words like emancipation and liberty, without knowing what either truly meant. Among those children sat Thomas. He could not have been older than 9. Thin shoulders, bare feet hardened by years of labor, dark eyes that seemed much older than his face. Unlike many children his age, Thomas rarely laughed. He observed. He remembered. He noticed every expression adults tried to hide. Fear had taught him that silence often revealed more than conversation. Each morning before sunrise, he followed his mother into the fields. The frozen ground cut through worn shoes that barely held together. His small hands gathered fallen branches, fetched water, carried baskets far heavier than any child should lift. His mother always walked beside him whenever possible. Her name was Sarah. She spoke softly, almost as though a sentence carried the risk of punishment. Whenever Thomas stumbled beneath a heavy load, she smiled despite her exhaustion. "Keep your head high," she whispered. "They can own your hands." She gently touched his forehead. "But never let them own what's here." Thomas never forgot those words, not because he fully understood them, but because they were spoken with a determination stronger than fear itself. Every evening after labor ended, Sarah told stories beneath the stars. Stories passed through generations, stories of African kings, of rivers wider than oceans, of ancestors who carried courage inside their hearts when chains surrounded their bodies. Thomas listened carefully. He memorized every word, not realizing those stories would one day become the only inheritance his mother could leave behind. For the plantation itself had begun to collapse beneath the weight of war. The owner, Elias Rutledge, had once considered himself among Virginia's wealthiest landowners. Now debts consumed him. Harvests failed. Supplies disappeared. Confederate officers demanded horses. Taxes increased. Workers fled whenever opportunity appeared. Every month, another piece of property vanished to satisfy creditors. Furniture, livestock, equipment, anything valuable enough to delay financial ruin. But eventually, there was nothing left except the people he claimed to own. The auctions returned, not because prosperity demanded them, because desperation did. Families watched strangers arrive carrying ledgers instead of rifles. Men walked through slave quarters examining people the way merchants inspected cattle. Teeth, muscles, hands, children. Everything possessed a price. Thomas noticed something changing inside his mother's eyes. She hugged him longer each night. She stopped speaking about tomorrow. Instead, she repeated one request over and over. If we're ever separated, she struggled to continue. Promise me you'll remember your name. Thomas frowned. My name? She nodded. Names disappear first. He did not understand. Soon he would. One bitter morning, wagons rolled onto the plantation before sunrise. The overseer ordered everyone into neat rows. Nobody asked questions. Questions often invited punishment. Thomas stood beside Sarah as unfamiliar men unfolded papers and began calling names, one by one. Families stepped forward. Some returned. Others climbed into wagons without speaking. Children cried. Babies screamed. Old men stared toward empty fields with defeated eyes. Thomas squeezed his mother's hand tighter. She squeezed back, hard enough to hurt, hard enough to say everything words could not. Hours passed. Finally, Sarah. Her name echoed across the frozen yard. She stepped forward. Thomas. The second name followed immediately afterward. Relief flooded the boy's face. At least they would remain together. But then another voice interrupted. No. The man consulting the ledger shook his head. The woman stays. The boy goes. Time itself seemed to stop. Sarah froze. Thomas looked from one stranger to another, waiting for someone to correct the mistake. No one did. The overseer approached. You heard him. Thomas clung desperately to his mother's dress. I don't want to go. She knelt before him, forcing herself to smile through tears that refused to stop falling. You remember your name, he nodded. And the stories, another nod. And who you are, I know. She placed both hands upon his face. You are never what they say you are. The overseer grabbed Thomas by the arm. Sarah refused to let go. For one impossible moment, mother and son pulled against opposite forces, one holding with love, the other with authority. Then the grip broke. Thomas stumbled forward. Sarah collapsed onto frozen earth. Her screams echoed across the plantation long after the wagon began moving away. Thomas twisted around until she disappeared beyond the trees. That was last time he ever saw his mother, or so he believed. The wagon traveled for hours. Children sat silently beside strangers who had also lost everything. Nobody spoke. Nobody cried anymore. Grief had become too large for tears. Near sunset, they reached a small trading post, crowded with buyers searching for cheap labor before the Confederacy collapsed completely. Most purchasers ignored Thomas. He was too young, too thin, too small. One merchant laughed openly. That one won't survive the winter. Another shrugged. Worthless. Hours passed. No one bid. Finally, an elder traveler wearing worn Union Scout's coat approached the auctioneer. What are you asking? The auctioneer sighed impatiently. $3. The old man looked directly in Thomas's frightened eyes. There was something unusual in the way the boy stared back, not pleading, not broken, simply watching, measuring. Remembering, the traveler slowly reached into his pocket and placed 3 silver coins onto the wooden table. The auctioneer barely looked up. Sold. $3. Less than the price of a saddle. Less than a week's supply of feed. Less than the boots worn by the men conducting the sale. No applause followed. No celebration. Only silence. Yet neither man realized that the frightened child walking away beside the old stranger carried something no price could ever measure. A memory, a promise, and a future that was already beginning to change. Neither of them could possibly know that this forgotten purchase would soon place Thomas Freeman at the center of events that would ripple through a nation struggling to redefine freedom itself. And the first test of that destiny would arrive before the next sunrise. The old man never spoke during the first mile. Neither did Thomas. Only the frozen wheels creaked against the dirt road as dusk settled over the Virginia countryside. The trees stood like dark skeletons against a sky stained with smoke from distant battlefields. Every gust of wind carried the smell of damp earth, burned timber, and gunpowder. Thomas had no idea where he was being taken. He had learned that asking questions rarely changed anything. Instead, he watched. The old man's coat was faded Union blue, though it no longer carried any military buttons. His boots were worn almost through the soles. A faded leather satchel rested against his side, filled with folded papers rather than weapons. Finally, the stranger broke the silence. What is your name, son? Thomas hesitated. His mother's final words echoed inside his mind. Remember your name. He swallowed. Thomas Freeman. The old man smiled gently. A good name. Thomas looked down. They don't call me that. What do they call you? Boy. The old man's expression hardened. They may have called you that. He looked toward the road ahead. I won't. Those simple words stirred something unfamiliar inside Thomas, respect. It had been so long since anyone besides his mother had spoken to him as though he mattered. The stranger introduced himself as Samuel Carter, a civilian scout who carried messages and guided Union patrols through the forests of Virginia. He was too old to fight on the front lines, but not too old to serve. He explained very little, only enough for Thomas to understand one thing. They were traveling north, toward Union territory, toward uncertainty. Every mile increased the danger. Confederate patrols still roamed the countryside, searching for escaped slaves, Union scouts, and anyone suspected of helping them. Roads changed hands almost daily. One morning, a village belonged to the Confederacy. By evening, Union soldiers marched through its streets. No place remained safe for long. As darkness covered the forest, Samuel led the wagon onto a narrow trail hidden beneath towering pines. "We stop here." Thomas climbed down carefully. His legs trembled after hours of sitting. Samuel gathered dry branches, and soon a small fire flickered beneath the trees. The warm light danced across Thomas's frightened face. Samuel handed him a piece of cornbread. "Eat slowly." Thomas stared at it. It was the largest piece of bread he had held in months. He broke it in half. Samuel noticed. "You don't have to save it." Thomas shook his head. "I'm saving it for tomorrow." The old man looked away before answering. No child should have to think like that. Thomas quietly wrapped half the bread inside a cloth anyway. Old habits survived even when circumstances changed. That night, neither of them slept well. Far away, cannon fire rolled across the hills like distant thunder. The war never truly rested. Neither did fear. Days passed. Their journey became a pattern of careful movement. Travel before sunrise, hide before noon, avoid bridges, avoid towns, avoid strangers. Sometimes they passed abandoned farms where broken wagons stood exactly where families had left them months earlier. Sometimes they found churches converted into hospitals. The cries of wounded soldiers drifted through broken windows. Thomas had never imagined so much suffering could exist in one world. One afternoon, they encountered a group of exhausted civilians walking south. Women, children, an elderly preacher. Everything they owned fit inside a single wagon. One woman warned Samuel, "Confederate cavalry crossed the river yesterday." Samuel thanked her, then quietly changed direction. Thomas noticed. "You believed her." Samuel nodded. People running from war rarely waste words. That sentence stayed with Thomas. He began paying attention not only to what people said, but to what they feared. A week later, snow began falling. The forest grew silent beneath blankets of white. Tracks became impossible to hide. Samuel frowned each morning after studying the ground. "We're leaving a trail." Thomas looked behind them. Their footprints stretched for hundreds of yards. "What do we do?" Samuel answered calmly. "We keep moving." Late that afternoon, Thomas heard something. Hoofbeats, very distant. Then louder. Samuel heard them too. Without hesitation, he pulled the wagon beneath dense cedar trees. "Hurry!" Thomas climbed down. Samuel covered the wagon with cut branches until it blended almost perfectly into the forest. Then both disappeared behind fallen logs. Minutes later, 6 Confederate horsemen rode along the road. Thomas held his breath. One horse stopped. Its rider studied the snowy ground. He pointed toward fresh wagon tracks. Thomas's heart pounded so loudly he feared the soldiers would hear it. Another rider dismounted. He examined the trail. Samuel slowly placed one hand over Thomas's shoulder, not to restrain him, to steady him. The searching soldier followed the tracks toward the hidden wagon. 20 steps, 15, 10. Thomas could now see the man's face clearly. The soldier reached for the covering branches. Then a rifle shot echoed somewhere across the valley. Every horse suddenly reared. The soldiers looked toward the sound. Their officer shouted, "Move!" Within seconds, the patrol galloped away toward what they believed was another engagement. Silence returned. Thomas released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Samuel whispered softly. Today, he looked toward the disappearing riders. God was walking these woods. Their escape brought them closer to Union lines. The difference appeared almost immediately. Burned plantations stood abandoned. Former slave quarters sat empty, their doors swinging in the wind. Here and there, small groups of newly freed families traveled together, carrying blankets, cooking pots, and children. No one knew exactly where they were going, only where they refused to return. Thomas watched them with quiet fascination. Some smiled despite their exhaustion. Others simply stared ahead. Freedom, he realized, did not erase pain. It merely allowed people to choose where to carry it. Several days later, they reached a Union encampment near the edge of the James River. Hundreds of tents stretched across muddy ground. Campfires filled the cold evening with smoke. Black and white soldiers worked side by side repairing wagons, preparing meals, and tending the wounded. Thomas had never seen anything like it. No overseers carrying whips, no auction blocks, no chains, only organized chaos driven by survival rather than ownership. Samuel led him toward the medical tents. An army doctor examined Thomas. He needs food. Another pause. And rest. Samuel nodded. I can manage both. For the first time in years, Thomas slept inside a real bed. The blanket felt impossibly soft. He lay awake for hours, not because he was afraid, because he had forgotten what safety felt like. The following morning, Samuel introduced Thomas to a small school operating beneath a large canvas tent. A young teacher stood before 24 children. Some were formerly enslaved. Others were orphans whose fathers had died in battle. Each child held a worn slate. Thomas stopped outside the entrance. What is this? A classroom. I don't belong there. Samuel looked surprised. Why not? They said learning was forbidden. Samuel slowly opened the tent flap. They lied. Thomas stepped inside with cautious footsteps. The teacher smiled warmly. What is your name? He answered louder than before. Thomas Freeman. She nodded. Welcome, Thomas. Then she handed him a piece of chalk. It seemed like the smallest object in the world. Yet when Thomas held it, his hands began shaking. He had spent years carrying firewood, buckets, tools, baskets, never a pencil, never chalk, never knowledge. The teacher carefully wrote one word across the board, freedom. She pointed toward the letters. Can anyone tell me what this says? Most children remained silent. Thomas stared at the strange symbols. They looked meaningless. Tiny white marks, nothing more. Yet everyone around him treated them as though they possessed incredible power. He wanted desperately to understand why. The teacher smiled. Before this war ends, she looked across every young face. Each of you will learn to read. Thomas clenched the chalk tighter. For the first time in his life, he desired something no one could steal. Knowledge. He had no idea that within a few weeks, the ability to recognize a single handwritten message would place him at the center of a dangerous secret. one that could save hundreds of lives or destroy everything he had just begun to believe in. Outside the school tent, unnoticed by everyone inside, a weary Union courier rode into camp carrying a blood-stained satchel. Hidden among the papers inside was a coded document that several Confederate spies had already killed to obtain. Before another sunset, that document would vanish, and the last person anyone would expect to find it would be a quiet boy named Thomas Freeman, who had once been sold for only $3. Before the next sunrise, the entire Union camp was awake. Boots pounded across frozen ground. Officers shouted orders between rows of tents. Mounted scouts rode in every direction, searching the nearby woods. The courier's satchel had been found lying beside a water barrel. Its leather strap had been sliced clean through. Every document remained inside, except one. A single folded dispatch had disappeared. No one knew whether it had been stolen by a Confederate spy or simply lost in the confusion of the previous evening. But everyone understood one thing. If the missing paper reached Confederate commanders, hundreds of Union soldiers could march directly into an ambush. Fear spread through the camp faster than the morning fog. Thomas watched from outside the school tent. The adults moved with urgency he had never seen before. He remembered something Samuel had taught him. People running from danger rarely wasted words. He listened carefully. The river crossing, enemy scouts, find that paper. Every sentence carried the same quiet panic. Samuel appeared moments later. Stay close to the school today. Thomas nodded. But something inside him felt unsettled. As he walked toward the cooking fires, he noticed scraps of paper blowing through the muddy camp. Soldiers ignored them. They had more important things to worry about. Thomas bent down to gather them anyway. Old habits remained. Nothing useful was ever wasted. Most were empty. One listed supplies. Another carried half of a letter. Then, beneath the wheel of an abandoned wagon, he saw a tightly folded page, stained with dried mud. It looked different, thicker, more carefully folded. He picked it up. Across one corner appeared an official military seal. Thomas could not read the words, but he recognized importance. He remembered how carefully the courier had protected his satchel the day before. Without opening it, Thomas carried the paper toward Samuel. Halfway there, a voice interrupted. "Boy!" Thomas froze. The word struck him like cold iron. Slowly he turned. A stranger stood beside a supply wagon. His uniform resembled that of a Union soldier, yet something about him felt wrong. His boots carried fresh red clay, unlike the dark mud surrounding the camp. His rifle showed almost no wear. Most of all, his eyes never smiled. "What have you found?" Thomas instinctively hid the folded paper behind his back. "Nothing." The man stepped closer. "I'll take it." Thomas remembered his mother's voice. "You are never what they say you are." Without another word, he ran. The stranger cursed loudly. "Stop him!" Thomas sprinted between tents. Behind him came heavy footsteps. Soldiers turned in confusion as the chase cut through the middle of camp. Cooking pots crashed. Horses reared. Someone shouted. Thomas had spent his childhood outrunning overseers. Years of fear had made him fast. He darted beneath wagons too low for grown men to follow. He slipped through narrow gaps between stacked barrels. The stranger continued chasing him with desperate determination. That alone told Thomas everything. The paper mattered very much. Ahead, Samuel looked up. "Thomas!" The boy threw the folded dispatch with all his strength. Samuel caught it. At that exact moment, the stranger pulled a hidden revolver. He never fired. 3 Union soldiers tackled him before the trigger could be pulled. Within seconds, the camp surrounded the man. His uniform was searched. Hidden beneath his coat, they discovered Confederate documents, false identification papers, and coded maps. The mysterious soldier had never belonged there. He had been waiting for the missing dispatch. Thomas stood trembling behind Samuel, not from exhaustion, from the realization that he had nearly handed the paper to the wrong man. The missing dispatch was immediately delivered to Union headquarters. Inside were detailed orders describing a planned movement across the James River and the exact timing of several troop columns. Had Confederate commanders obtained those instructions, they could have prepared artillery positions and devastating ambushes along the crossing. Instead, the plans were quietly altered. Routes changed. Departure times shifted. Several dangerous crossings were abandoned altogether. Only a handful of senior officers ever learned how close disaster had come. Fewer still learned who had recovered the document. The official reports mentioned only a young civilian. No medals followed. No newspaper headlines appeared. The war moved too quickly for forgotten children to become famous. Yet Samuel knew, the camp commander knew, and every soldier who witnessed the chase remembered the fearless little boy who refused to surrender a folded piece of paper. Weeks passed. Winter slowly surrendered to spring. Across Virginia, Confederate defenses weakened. More plantations emptied. More enslaved families crossed into Union lines carrying hope they had scarcely dared to imagine. Thomas continued attending the little school beneath the canvas tent. Every day he learned another letter, another word, another sentence. Reading no longer seemed impossible. One afternoon, his teacher handed him a thin reader. "You've earned this." Thomas carefully opened the first page. Slowly, painfully, he sounded out each word. The room fell silent. The children watched. Samuel watched from outside the tent. When Thomas finally reached the end of the first paragraph, tears quietly filled his eyes. Not because reading was difficult, because he realized no one could ever take those words away. Chains could bind hands, though could not imprison knowledge. His mother's promise returned to him. Remember your name. Now he could write it. Thomas Freeman. Each letter felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. Months later, the Great War finally drew toward its end. News traveled through camps like wildfire. Cities surrendered. Armies laid down their weapons. Church bells rang across towns that had known nothing but mourning. Then came the announcement so many had prayed to hear. Slavery had been destroyed by law. The institution that had stolen generations of lives had come to an end. People embraced. Some laughed. Many simply stood in stunned silence. Freedom felt almost too enormous to understand. Thomas looked toward the southern horizon. Somewhere beyond those distant hills stood the plantation where his childhood had ended. Somewhere his mother might still be alive. Samuel rested a hand on his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" Thomas answered quietly. "I'm going home." The journey back took several days. The roads looked different now. The war had left scars everywhere, broken bridges, burned homes, abandoned fields reclaimed by wild grass. When they finally reached the plantation, Thomas almost failed to recognize it. The grand house stood empty, windows shattered, its white paint peeled away beneath years of neglect. Slave cabins stood silent beneath towering oaks. The place that had once seemed so powerful had become nothing more than weathered wood and fading memories. Thomas walked slowly across the familiar ground. Every step awakened another memory. The water well, the old fence, the field where he had worked beside Sarah. He found the place where they had been separated. Nothing remained, only frozen earth, now softened by spring rain. He whispered into the wind. I remembered. The breeze carried his words across the empty fields. No answer came. Yet somehow he felt she had heard. Samuel uncovered records left behind after the plantation's abandonment. Among scattered pages appeared a single entry. Sarah Freeman, transferred, later released, following Union occupation. No destination recorded. She had survived. Whether she ever learned what became of her son remained unknown. History often leaves such questions unanswered. Some stories end with certainty. Others end with hope. Years passed. Thomas grew into a man. He became a teacher in a small Virginia community, believing that every child deserved the chance once denied to him. People often asked why he cared so deeply about books. He would smile before answering. Because someone once paid $3 for my future. He looked toward rows of eager young faces, and knowledge made it priceless. No monument was ever raised in his honor. No famous portrait hung in government buildings. His name appeared in few records. Like countless ordinary people, he helped shape history without expecting history to remember him. Sometimes the greatest changes begin not with presidents or generals, but with a frightened child who refuses to let fear make his choices. A child who remembers his name. A child who protects a single piece of paper. A child who discovers that the greatest freedom is not merely walking without chains. It is living with a mind no one can ever own. And perhaps that is the quiet truth history whispers most often. The people who change the world are not always the ones whose names fill the books. Sometimes they are the ones who first learned how to write their own.